Hello, everyone. My name is Larissa DeLuna with the American Heart Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Southwest Affiliates Stroke Bootcamp series. We are excited to offer this 15-week course as a way to educate stroke coordinators and key components of their role, provide tools and resources to build and maintain successful programs, and to assist in building a large network of peers. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. To avoid background noise, all lines have been placed on mute. For questions, you can unmute your line by pressing *6 or type in the Q&A section of WebEx. Please note, you will only be able to claim your CME CE credits at the end of our 15-week session on September 27th. For the next set of calls, we will direct you to SWA Quality for the WebEx links and how to log in. We'll include all this information and a copy of today's slides that will be sent to you in about a week from today's call. Today we have Alex Graves. She is an adult and acute care nurse practitioner and the Cerebral Vascular Program Manager for a region in Colorado that includes 5 hospitals. She's primarily located at the Comprehensive Stroke Center, St. Anthony Hospital. She splits her time between patient care and program development. She has successfully led both primary and comprehensive stroke center certification preparation and site visits numerous times. She has an interest in quality improvement projects and has pursued formal training in this area. She has completed the Postgraduate Acute Neurovascular Advanced Practitioners Fellowship through NetSmart. She has partnered with bedside nurses, physicians, pharmacists, and therapists on multiple projects that have led to research studies, publications, and presentations. Most recently, she has worked on 2 book chapters, the first entitled Intracerebral Hemorrhagic Stroke, and the other Stroke Coordination, Administrative and Clinical Quality Oversight. At this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Alex to start today's presentation.
Great, thanks, Larissa. I hope you guys can all hear me. I just want to thank you for having me to give this presentation as we kick off this webinar series. And I am excited about this today and the upcoming Thursday sessions that we have in store for us. I know a lot of information is going to be shared. At first, when I just clicked on again, I noticed there were 15 people signed in, but then I refreshed, and I think we're up to 170. So I don't know if everyone's getting counted twice for the time they sign in by phone and computer, but either way, we've got a great audience here today. And I know that a lot of what we do and our individual programs look very different, but I also know we have a lot of things that are in common. I know, too, that as stroke coordinators, we could probably share more with each other. And so today, I'm going to share with you some different best practices. In these upcoming sessions, we're going to talk about quality improvement techniques. We're going to talk about job descriptions a little bit, scope of service documents, and research opportunities within these next couple webinar series as well. So specifically this morning, I'm going to be sharing with you on some of my thoughts and ideas about our stroke coordinator role. And I think any talk is better when it can be interactive, so we've thrown in a few survey questions. Unfortunately, I can't ask you to raise your hand or that type of thing, but we'll ask you a couple questions in a few minutes. And then please feel free to ask questions at the end, leave your question. You know, this has been a very dynamic group as we've gotten together and prepared these webinar series, and so I know that this audience is the same. My guess is that you're probably multitasking right now. You're doing 10 things at once and tuning in and eating lunch, but I think that we'll look forward to the conversation we're about to have. I also want to thank many of my colleagues, and also Christy Casper, who I work with, and she's helped a lot in the development of the content we're about to share. And this book chapter that Larissa mentioned that is still pending publication, but we're working on it and hope to get something in writing out there about the description of our role as stroke coordinators. All right, so I'll get started. My only disclosure is that I do some consultant work with Stryker. And here are the objectives. So today I want to talk about stroke coordination and what we've seen happen because of it. We'll then discuss details about how we define the role of the stroke coordinator, and finally we'll discuss some tips to stay content in our roles and maybe even love what we do, prevent that dreaded word burnout. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Before I start, Larissa's going to have some questions that pop up so that you can virtually raise your hand and we can get to know a little bit more about each other. So the first question you should see pop up on your screen is, how long have you been in your role with your stroke program? I know not everyone on the call is a stroke coordinator, so we'll leave this survey up for a few seconds while you guys all answer. I have the privilege of getting to talk in front of a lot of different stroke coordinators through this role and then through my role with Stryker, and so I just find that it's always such a mixed audience where you have so many people that are experienced and then quite a few people that are in that 1 year or less mark. Okay, so we're still polling for a few more seconds, I think. Okay, great. So we've got, so about 60 people that have been in this role for 3 years or less, half of those a year or less, a couple of you 5 years or less, and then 3 of us 10 years or more. All right. So as you can see, we've got a lot of new people in this role, and I have to say when we first came together to start planning these webinar series, we thought these need to be offered more often because we don't have a structured orientation, the support we need ongoing, and a lot of you have been in this role for such a little amount of time. Okay, great. So we've got another question that's going to pop up. Okay, if you could just answer, are you at a PSC or a soon-to-be PSC or same for a CSC? We'll give you guys a few more seconds. It looks like it's tallying it up now. Okay, great. So about 60 of us work at primary stroke centers, 17 at comprehensive stroke centers. Okay, good. So, this is highlighting our similarities and highlighting our differences like I was just referring to. Okay, great. And I think there's one more question. Who do you report up through? So do you report up through a nurse manager, your ED nurse director, your CNO, so through the Department of Nursing? Do you report through your quality department? I think a lot of us, that used to be more common. I know, though, that it still does occur. Do you report through a service line, like the neuroscience service line, or do you report through the physician route through, say, something like the Department of Neurology? All right, we should have the answers here soon, I think. Okay, so, wow, more than I thought report through the quality department. So 37 of us through Department of Nursing, which I think is becoming more and more common. Quality department, there's 32, service line 13, and then Department of Neurology 4. Okay, great. So a lot of variability with those of us on the call. And then the last question I'm going to ask, but this is not one that's going to be printed on your screen, but this is basically, I'm guessing a lot of you will be nodding your head, but I think a lot of us, can you nod your head if you feel like this role could be more clear to you or to others, maybe even to your boss, or if you wish you had more help with coordinating your programs, or if you've ever wondered about going back to the bedside or searching for another job opportunity. I think I probably caught everyone with a couple of those questions there, but I'm not going to ask you to respond to a survey there. All right. Okay, so our first part, we're going to talk a little bit about stroke coordination. So we've all seen the information on this slide. We know the statistics that are listed here. And we always, I think, oftentimes start out many of our stroke presentations with this information. But what I'm going to tell you is some of the positive things here is that actually if you've been in this role for a while, you've seen that the death rate of stroke has actually declined. And some would even say that that's due to the work that we're doing, in the development of organized stroke centers. Because when you think about it, the organization we're creating leads to that uniformity where you have stroke alerts that occur the same no matter the time of day or the day of week, not just when a certain ED physician is on. Our programs lead to the uniformity in TPA being readily available and not running into those situations where you ran out of your PAR of 2 and therefore you can't give TPA to your third patient. We're able to standardize our secondary stroke prevention when someone's come in with a stroke, where we address on all patients things that we've included in our order sets, and not just because our certain neurologist is on and can remember to do all of those things. So I think while we share this information on this slide, it actually is pretty exciting for us in the world of stroke coordination, because I think we've had a role in the development of these organized stroke centers, providing the better clinical outcomes and increased use of TPA. You know, stating the obvious, regardless of hospital size, regardless of available workforce, patients will present with an acute stroke either to your emergency department, even if it's not by EMS because you're not a stroke center and maybe you're at a state where you're being bypassed. People will walk in, or an already hospitalized stroke patient will have an in-hospital stroke. There's some evidence that the occurrence of stroke happening in the hospital occurs anywhere between 4 to 17% of all strokes. So hospital stroke programs, therefore, must be designed to ensure that patients have access to excellent care no matter the size of the hospital, day of week, time of day, which practitioner's on, et cetera. All hospitals need to have an organized stroke system with a process to treat those acute stroke patients when they are identified. And then even small organizations will need to have, small organizations will need to have a guideline in place to then transfer those patients to a center that offers that higher level of care. And many large hospitals will strive to provide that highest level of stroke care, that comprehensive stroke certification. So bottom line is some sort of stroke coordination is a must. A multidisciplinary stroke service will need to lead that charge, and team members of that multidisciplinary stroke service should include a medical director, an administrator, and I'm going to say, quote, trained nursing staff to help coordinate care. Ironically, several of the documents that we use to guide our certification plans with primary stroke certification and comprehensive stroke certification, these documents come from the Brain Attack Coalition and the American Stroke Association. They make the recommendation for development of acute stroke teams, including a physician trained in diagnosing and treating cerebrovascular disorders, and I put this in quotes, one other healthcare provider, i.e. a nurse, a PA, an NP. But there's no mention of the recommendation of a stroke coordinator, so I always find that ironic and like to bring that up because we're actually not listed as being recommended in the guidelines. The Brain Attack Coalition and the American Stroke Association also recommend development of written protocols, EMS collaboration stroke units, formation of education programs with hours required, outcomes and quality improvement programs with data collection and pursuit of stroke center certification. So the question, and you all are on the call so you know the answer, but who better to own and coordinate all of these elements than us as stroke coordinators? Well, the organizations that I mentioned make recommendations for that additional healthcare provider. Again, they don't acknowledge that role as a stroke coordinator. So I think, though, we know the role that we play in coordinating our stroke programs. So despite the lack of recommendation, it's evident that stroke coordinators have become essential to stroke team and implementing and providing quality stroke patient care. The stroke coordinator role has grown rapidly in many countries, but really, as we all know, there's been little standardization and or education for this role. And, you know, we know that that's unfortunate. This role is complex. Even our people we report to don't understand this role very well. It has many components that vary from hospital vary from one hospital to the next. And we all represent a group of highly educated, experienced, multi-talented professionals that have developed remarkably similar roles across the world. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk about some of those similarities today. There's an international study that revealed that these professionals, us as stroke coordinators, have primarily taught themselves the role, have forged ahead in many ways to become the face of the stroke service and a driving force for establishment of coordinated hospital-based stroke programs. So, as you are becoming a stroke program, a stroke center, one of the places to start with getting to know your program is starting with a gap analysis. And whether you're starting out for the first time or you're a center that's looking to strengthen your program, better understand your stroke program, starting with a gap analysis is something I recommend. This can be tedious. This can take a lot of attention to detail. But I will tell you it will lead to success and some great conversations that will be had about better understanding your program. And understanding current state versus desired state is pretty crucial. So the gap analysis should include volume of patients, patient care elements, and then administrative and support elements. And I will share that with you on these upcoming slides. Also, for those of you who are here today, you will get a copy of these slides in the next couple of days, I believe. Okay, so gap analysis starts with listing out your volumes. So as we all know, the volumes that make up our stroke program are ischemic stroke, our TIA, and our hemorrhagic stroke. Now this is based on our small list that we all were very familiar with our ICD-9 codes. And I will tell you that we can no longer use this short and sweet list. Instead, we have to use our ICD-10 codes, and I can't even fit a quarter of the ICD-10 codes on this slide, so I didn't even attempt to do that. I guess I attempted with a quarter. But anyway, we know that this takes a lot of work looking at all of the volumes, but to get a sense as to the type of patients that you're seeing in the hospital is pretty crucial. One hospital I worked with, we realized that our hemorrhagic stroke volume was very high, representing more than a third of our volume. And so this was important for us to recognize and then, of course, tailor your program accordingly. Do you have the right protocols, the right order sets, the right educational offerings tailored to the fact that your volume of hemorrhagic stroke is that high? Not to mention the MD coverage for that type of volume. I'd also recommend things like getting to know your TIA volume and looking at how your TIA volume compares to other Colorado hospitals or other hospitals within your state, within your region, within the nation that we can pull from Get With the Guidelines. You know, if we have our TIA volume at 40%, whereas the rest of the hospitals in our region is much lower than that, it might cause us to say, there's a discrepancy here. Could this be a coding problem? Are strokes being coded out as TIAs and not as strokes, and lead to you being able to look at that volume a little bit more closely. The next part of the gap analysis is looking at elements of patient care elements, and I'll just touch on some of these briefly. If you're not familiar with this American Stroke Association guideline that's listed here, I would be familiar with it. There's one for primary stroke and there's one for comprehensive stroke. But really this is where this gap analysis comes from, and it's also where our Joint Commission and DNV standards around primary stroke and comprehensive stroke come from as well. So what this document tells us is that for patient care elements, we need to have an acute stroke team. An acute stroke team, as they delineate in this article, is one that responds to acute stroke, initiates initial diagnostic tests, immediate care. And so questions you would ask yourself as you're going through this gap analysis are, how are acute stroke patients at your hospital currently being identified? What type of stroke alert is being called? What's the stroke alert criteria? Who can call the stroke alert? We also want to look at things like personnel with experience and expertise in cerebral vascular disease. Are there dedicated personnel that are currently responding to patients with a suspected stroke? This guideline listed here recommends that you need to have at least 2 members, one physician and another healthcare provider, as I mentioned earlier. This guideline also recommends that there should be a team that is able to respond within 15 minutes. So as part of your gap analysis, you're asking yourselves, okay, who is currently a part of that team? Are they responding within that time frame? How are they alerted? Is there a chronic pager problem or cell phone problem? Is it overhead announced? And starting to get to know those things about your program. The next patient care element is written care protocols. In this guideline, you'll see the written care protocols are things like order sets. So in your gap analysis, you're asking about what are your current stroke-related protocols, guidelines, policies, and order sets. This guideline also suggests to us that these need to be available in every area for staff caring for a stroke patient. So as your gap analysis, where are they located? How do staff access them? I've always loved the idea of a brain box. So in any stroke-related unit, you've got that go-to mobile file cabinet-like box where, you know, call it the brain box, put a sticker on there, and in that it has stroke-related materials there for staff and patients. This guideline also suggests that we need to design our program around clinical practice guidelines. So how have clinical practice guidelines been selected at your hospitals? What are the current clinical practice guidelines? Are you up to date with the most recent clinical practice guidelines? And this guideline, I'm using the word guideline a lot, but this clinical practice guideline that I have a screenshot of also is the document that tells us that these guidelines, these order sets, these protocols should be reviewed annually. So another question to ask yourself in this gap analysis is, what is our process of reviewing these documents? And I'm not going to go into all the rest of these listed here, but you will find this in this American Stroke Association recommendations for PSCs, where it touches on each of these patient care elements. The next part of the gap analysis that's also highlighted in that PSC document is looking at administrative support elements. So the first element is institutional commitment and support. So it's things like the neurologist being available to assist in the care of stroke patients. So your gap analysis is asking questions like, are the neurologists available to assist in the care of stroke patients? Do patients see a neurologist anytime they're admitted with a stroke? If neurologists are not available in person 24/7, has telemedicine been arranged? What is your consistent method of coverage? Another component of that is administrative support for becoming a primary stroke center. So this guideline highlights that there needs to be administrative support for your program. So a gap analysis question is, how is that support demonstrated? Is there a budget designated to the stroke program? Is there, first of all, a stroke coordinator hired to be in place of this program? And also, where does the stroke program fit in with the overall organization? I've seen some stroke coordinators who are hired to report to their ED director, and that can work out really well, but that also can isolate them to one area of the hospital and not really allow them to get to all the other, not allow them to get to the overall organization and all the components that might be missing if they're just asked to kind of just be in the emergency department. Of course, part of this PSC recommendation asks us to consider compensation for neurologists, neurosurgeons, others who take call. So a question in your gap analysis is, have they agreed to take call if needed for the evaluation and management of stroke patients? Yep, I already mentioned the dedicated stroke budget as well, being one way in which you can show administrative support by administration. So again, if you'd like a copy of this, I can provide a longer copy. This is what will be in your slides that you receive, but here's an example of the gap analysis with the different items I mentioned in that first column, and then questions to ask in that final column. Okay, so my guess is that this is not the audience that needed the last 10 slides or so to convince you that we are essential to a successful stroke program, but I wanted to start there to kind of give you some tips on how you make the case for your role, and some of that is with that gap analysis and kind of asking the question, well, who better to coordinate a lot of these things than a stroke coordinator in the roles that we're in. And I have to tell you, with changes in healthcare, with roles being cut and added, we need to be able to make our case. So I think you all know that very well. All right, so moving on, what is a stroke coordinator? We work with a team of people to design and implement our stroke program, providing that standardized care. So this seems pretty straightforward, but I'm just going to ask you to reflect on a couple things. So do you work with an interdisciplinary team, or do you work as a team of one? And unfortunately, I've seen people that truly feel like they're a team of one. And there might be times where that's how you're feeling and there's plans to hire up, but, you know, the idea of a stroke program is that you're working with an interdisciplinary team. Are you working at implementing a program that is providing that standardized care and not having a CMO or a CNO or you know, leadership that allows, oh yeah, we do it that way, but you know what, if it's Dr. Jones or if it's, you know, whoever it is, then yeah, just let him do it his way. That's how we've always done it. That's not the intent of a stroke program and what we're trying to design. Also providing that standardized care for that, like I mentioned earlier, the day versus night, the weekend versus weekday, ED versus inpatient. A lot of us start with creating our ED stroke alert process, but then need to quickly move on to how is it that our inpatient stroke alerts get identified. And I mean, the joke on that topic is that in some ways you're better off having your stroke outside of the hospital and having 911 be called and present to the ED than you are, you know, right there in your very own hospital, just because sometimes we haven't put enough effort in recognizing and getting the process in place for those inpatient stroke alerts. And then is the program throughout the continuum of care? So as I just mentioned, if you report to an ED nurse manager and don't have the, you know, almost the ability or the okay to go and make this a continuum of care hospital-wide and even post-hospital program, then you're not meeting the intent of a true stroke program and stroke coordination. Okay, I didn't ask this survey question. I oftentimes do, but you know, oftentimes as stroke coordinators, we're chosen from the nursing field. I know that some of us don't have a nursing background, but for the majority of us, we do. We were either bedside nurses who liked the increased responsibility. We were probably, you know, the top nurses in the neuro ICU or in the ED, and they said, hey, you could take on this responsibility, come move into the stroke program. Or some of us are advanced practice nurses who have completed our master's programs, either nurse practitioners or clinical nurse specialists. And there are benefits and drawbacks to having RN versus APN in the role. You can see some of them listed here. I think the decision on what is best for your program is really based on the current needs of the stroke program, the existing resources, the size, whether the program is just getting started or established. For some programs, it might be time to hire multiple physicians, especially at comprehensive, where you're blending the coordinating responsibilities with clinical ones. There's a survey, and I believe, maybe I don't have it here, but there's a survey that revealed 55% of stroke coordinators are advanced practice nurses, and of those 55%, 50% were nurse practitioners and 30% were clinical nurse specialists. So we just have a very mixed identity in terms of who we are in this stroke coordinator role. Here's a suggested very brief job description with some basic professional requirements that oftentimes we'll find in a stroke coordinator job description. But I will tell you the role of, you've heard me talk about this if you've heard another one of my talks, but the role of the stroke coordinator is complex, and these are items that are not going to be on that job description. And as we all know, the success of our roles oftentimes is found in these individual personal skills that we all have. You know, I always give this example, but I remember a very defining moment in a stroke program at a hospital I worked at where my colleague and I felt like we were the peacekeepers. We had a neurologist who felt very passionate about one decision that he was making and a neurosurgeon that felt the exact opposite, to the point where the neurologist said, well, I'm not going to admit my post-TPA or any stroke patients to your neuro ICU. And it was pretty awful. And so feeling like the peacekeeper in that situation to say, okay, we got to come together to a common goal. What's the best thing here for our patients and our program? And so I'm sure many of you can relate to examples in which you've had to you know, rely on these personal skills and these character qualities that we have to have in order to be successful in these roles. I also just want to mention that it's pretty imperative we have a good working relationship with our stroke medical director. And I would just encourage you that if you're not meeting with your stroke medical director or your stroke physician champion at your hospital on a regular basis, you should be. You know, carving out some protected time with you and that stroke physician champion to devote to program development should be a requirement of all stroke medical directors. That should be an accepted responsibility on them. And in fact, oftentimes that's part of their contract and the financial incentive that they have as their stroke medical director. So moving on, this is a survey that was published about who we are in terms of who we report to. So this was a 2011, so I realize this is kind of dated, but 36% reported to Department of Nursing, 25% to Department of Quality, and 18% to Department of Neurology. So pretty well split, you know, somewhat similar to what you all responded earlier today. Okay, so as we talk about our role, it would be beneficial for us to think about a structured orientation. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, you know what? I just want to go back because I want to touch on one point here in terms of who we report to. Really, in a lot of ways, there are pros and cons with who our reporting structure is up through. But regardless of who we report to, our role is going to have both clinical and administrative duties. We're going to have those conversations about, you know, clinically related, whether you're an RN or an APN, where you're maybe questioning why aspirin was or wasn't used, or whatever it is, you're going to have those clinical conversations. And in your role, you're of course going to have administrative duties as well. So bottom line, we need to have those close working relationships with the nursing department, with the medical team that sometimes you get more when you report up through the Department of Neurology, and then with the quality department. So if you don't have a relationship with each of these groups, that would be something I would suggest for you to pursue. Okay, so the transition from bedside clinician, like I mentioned, a lot of us are bedside nurses that transition into the stroke coordinator role. This is oftentimes very difficult and challenging. Many of us leave, like I mentioned, kind of being in, you know, with a strong nurse in those areas we've left from, whether it be the ICU, the ED, the neuro floor. And when we go into this role where sometimes we feel like a team of one, we describe this lack of support by team members. We feel this unclear expectation for the role because our boss doesn't even know what the role's about. We go through periods of role isolation. We feel inadequate in being a stroke expert. And that's a hard transition to go through when you've come from a role where you were the expert. So I think thinking about a structured orientation plan can be a key variable to success in our role as stroke coordinators. I also think, and having been in this role for 10 years myself, I hate to say this because I feel like I can say that can date myself in a way, but it used to be where a lot of our hospitals were not part of bigger systems. So it really felt like we were doing everything on our own. We were really developing order sets from nothing. We were really developing stroke alert guidelines, scope of service documents from nothing. So it's been really great to see that as we've become systems of healthcare systems, that we've relied so much more on our stroke coordinators at our counterpart hospitals, or sometimes within our statewide stroke coordinator groups, to say, hey, has anyone worked on this project, and would you be willing to share what you've created? So I just, you know, having been in the stroke coordinator world, it's great to see the areas that we share hospitals in the system or statewide, or rather than having that isolation. And if you feel that way, I would recommend, you know, reaching out for someone who can mentor you or provide you with some of the information you're looking for. So as part of your orientation plan, stroke coordinators should spend some structured time with multiple departments so they can develop an understanding of how each of these departments function in the continuum of caring for our stroke patients. So again, don't just spend all your time in your emergency department getting to see how a stroke alert's run. You have to spend time, you know, equal time in all of these other areas to see that full continuum of care. Additionally, spending time in each department can provide the coordinator an opportunity to develop these relationships with personnel from these different departments. And doing that up front or annually, or, you know, is important, because when those problems arise or those tougher conversations, it's so much easier to go to that nurse manager and talk about an outlier or an issue you're seeing when you've already established a relationship with those different departments. So for example, you know, the coordinator could shadow an ED charge nurse for half a day. They could spend the second half of the day with an unit educator. But, you know, I think this is a valuable networking piece that people shouldn't just, or should look to include in their orientation. The stroke coordinator should also be introduced to upper level administrators in your hospital. In this new role, you'll be interacting with these leaders, and you'll be wanting to know what their vision is for the stroke program, just like you want them to know what your vision is for the stroke program. So a formal, informal introduction and conversation is important to have up front. Also, if you have not already, you need to make sure that you've met with your regulatory department, met with your quality department, and understand what it is that they do to help support disease-specific certification, to help support, you never know, they might be collecting data on stroke that you were not aware of or no one told you about, and so all of a sudden you don't want to be duplicating efforts. And some of you are probably laughing because you're like, oh my gosh, I wish I would find that to be the case, but you need to get to know these departments. So here is a suggested orientation plan. Again, this will be in the handouts, but just some different purposes listed for these different departments you're meeting with. Okay, I want to move on from our list of responsibilities, but how we prioritize this list really depends on our mission and vision. And I've been in cases where you just feel torn, and so a vision might be to provide things like the highest quality of care to our patients, or become the largest stroke center in the region. Or our vision at a university hospital might be to train nurses and physicians. Or our vision might be to be involved in cutting-edge research. And honestly, as we all know, it can be a combination of several of these visions. But it's important for your leadership team to define, and you included, and your medical director, to define a strategic plan for the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years. Is your vision and is your strategic plan to become stroke certified, and with that, what should guide that? Well, probably your gap analysis and what are things that are in the way to get you to that stroke certification. All right, so in order to be successful at meeting the expectations and responsibilities, our stroke coordinator, we need to be stroke experts. The stroke coordinator needs to be able to support hospital staff by becoming that person that people go to and look at for expertise in caring for stroke patients. We need to be readily available to provide consultations to physicians, nurses, therapists, patients. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's why us having a presence with seeing these patients, with seeing our clinical teams, some sort of daily or weekly rounds, responding to stroke alerts, I think is a very important part of our role, and oftentimes something that gets kind of pushed to the side when we have too much data to collect, or too many meetings to prepare for. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in order to become the expert, we need to pursue clinical expertise in the diagnosis and treatment of stroke. We need to have a firm understanding of secondary stroke prevention. Some of these guidelines, the guideline I mentioned earlier, these are guidelines that we should have copies of, and we're highlighting through, and we're having a really good understanding as to the clinical practice guidelines and some other documents that can help us become those experts. The coordinator needs to be a self-regulated learner. We're not going to be assigned different, we have to be able to plan and manage our own learning goals. Let me just put it that way. We have to have the self-confidence to realize that the learning curve is steep, and that it's lifelong of learning in this role and in the complex role of stroke. And we have a lot to learn from a medical treatment clinical perspective, as well as a lot to learn in program development, and even things like, how do I run a better meeting? I mean, I just learn things more in those two different areas the longer I'm in this role. So stroke expertise can be created and learned and developed in many different ways. I list some of the suggestions here. Usually if we're in an audience together, I would ask you all what are some different suggestions you have in terms of developing those stroke expertise, and maybe if we have time at the end, several of you could share some of those ways in which you've developed expertise. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions real quick. Oh, okay. I just have a comment. They're on the phone with Verizon right now trying to add more phone lines, so maybe there's a problem in some people calling in right now. Okay, sorry, I'll keep going. So be thinking of that as to how you develop your stroke expertise and ideas you would give for someone else as well. The next responsibility that we have as stroke coordinators is that direct patient care that we're involved in. We all have different comfort levels. Let me tell you, we all have different backgrounds. We all have different roles, whether it's RN or APN. and different patient care responsibilities based on what I just mentioned. So bedside nurses who have primarily worked in one area may not have as much knowledge or experience or comfort level in, say, going to the ED when they've always been on the neuro floor unit. APNs may have more experience, but their learning curve can still be steep as well. So some hospitals will choose to have clinical leads that are within the stroke program that respond to the ED and stroke alerts 24/7, provide that higher level of nursing care under the direction of the stroke team. One suggestion I have is participation in some sort of daily rounds as a stroke coordinator, or you coming up with the daily rounds and a process you have every other day, weekly. I mean, I'm not going to define it here, but some ways in which you're involved in that clinical side of things. So partner with your neurologist. Make sure, of course, you're going to these stroke alerts. There is such opportunity that you can have from learning from the neurologist while they're in a patient's room, going over imaging with that patient, while they're performing a detailed neurologic exam. And I will tell you, I've been in this experience before where I'm like, I can't round with you for 4 hours. And so we actually started, we timed that particular neurologist to say, hey, we've got to trim this down a little bit because there's so much knowledge that can be passed on here, but yet I need this to be efficient for all of us. So here is a list of ideas for direct patient care that you can be involved in, some opportunities you can consider as you look at your responsibility with direct patient care. Okay, so in addition to those responsibilities I just listed, we have many others. We have responsibilities in stroke program development. It's a large component of our role, program governance, scope of service, and creating an ED algorithm I kind of consider to be the nuts and bolts of what we do. So touching briefly on each of these, in terms of governance, our stroke program, first of all, starts with us identifying those key stroke stakeholders and forming a governing body to collectively make decisions and implement action plans. Oftentimes we have a stroke leadership meeting. These are sometimes called stroke council. They're oftentimes under the direction of the stroke medical director and co-led by the stroke coordinator. This council, the charter here is to address processes, performance, quality improvement goals, address and correct global stroke program issues, handle processing, including program-related services through, oftentimes we do monthly meetings, we take attendance and minutes, we correct any program deficiencies, and we continue to optimize that patient care. For some of us, these are kind of our bread and butter of our stroke program, but for some of you that are just starting, you're just trying to wrap your head around, well, how do I form this stroke council? So there's some thoughts for you there that I just mentioned. Programs that are just establishing will often need to meet at least monthly, and honestly, I see a lot of us continuing to meet in that monthly pattern. Established programs could move towards less frequent, but I think we have so much new happening that oftentimes we do choose to meet monthly. Some other hospitals may use more of a service line approach where you're talking about stroke as well as all other neurologic programs. So there's a lot of different ways this can look. But you need to be able to speak to how these members are part of your team, how they're engaged, and if not, that's an issue. If you notice that one of these stakeholders has dropped off your attendance list for the last 4 months, that's where it's worth a call to say, hey, with crit care, identify what's the barrier for them attending to your meetings. Sometimes it's a matter of meeting with them individually because the time just doesn't work out, and sometimes they just need a reminder, and sometimes that needs to come from your stroke medical director. So after identifying your key stakeholders to be a part of your stroke council, the stroke coordinator should then be prepared to facilitate a team meeting, develop agendas, and assign and follow up action items. Okay, so for those of us that were bedside nurses and are now in this role of stroke coordinator, we have never run a meeting in our life. Let's just put it that way. So I've been a stroke coordinator for 10 years, and it wasn't until a few years ago that I actually received formal training on running a meeting and quality improvement. So here's some very, very brief tips on running a meeting that might be helpful for you to go over, but there's a lot out there on it. And so, I would encourage you maybe even meeting with your quality department or someone who can provide you with information about how to facilitate and run a meeting, because it can be challenging. Stroke programs of all sizes should have a stroke scope of service document. This is a useful document that is designed, implemented, supported by your stroke program. It's something you should review annually. It is something that should be formally approved by your stroke council and kind of serve as this agreed upon guide for your organization of the stroke program. You know, it's nice that, I think what happens is that we all create a document to address a swallow screen, a document to address how we staff CT or MRI or whatever it is, and all of a sudden we end up with 20 different documents. So this can be a catch-all document to include everything you see listed here on this slide, your mission and vision, your target audience of your stroke program, roles and responsibilities. I found this to be very helpful to list the expectations of key members of your stroke program, because we don't really oftentimes get to that in a job description, getting to the type of expectations that we can then list in a scope of service document that's agreed upon by everyone. And not only have I found this document to be helpful for stroke certification and a Joint Commission review or to share with the reviewers, it's also extremely helpful for new staff when they're coming on and they're saying, well, who does what, and what does your program entail? And it's a document that also highlights things like we have 24/7 MRI capabilities. It's kind of like your one-stop shop for all the information about your program. So it's been great for new staff. It's been great as a program overview. It's been great for other coordinators. It's been great to remind your boss what it is that you do and who does what. So anyway, if you don't have one, look to create one. Here are some of the other essential order sets, policies, protocols, guidelines, et cetera, that you should consider having. So some of them are pretty obvious to all of us, but hopefully you find this helpful if you're just getting started and want to make sure you have some of the recommended guidelines in place. Okay, so the majority of our stroke patients are identified through the emergency department, and that can be a pretty chaotic process. And so you as stroke coordinators, you know, you guys know the chaos more than anyone, because you go to these alerts and you see how it's done differently from neurologist to neurologist, from nurse to nurse. And so you identifying the chaos and realizing that, okay, some work needs to be done here is part of your role. So once a solid ED process can be created, it can then serve as a template to then talk about stroke care when you talk about in-hospital stroke alerts. So a key guideline that you'll start by creating if you haven't already, and that many of us are familiar with, is the ED algorithm, your stroke alert protocol. What are your time goals? What's your criteria? How do you activate that alert? What diagnostic tests are done? And in what priority? You know, for instance, do you get the CT and then stop and take a patient back to a room to give TPA and then bring them back? Or are you doing everything in the CT scanner? So this ED algorithm includes everything that you see listed here. And then who does what? So, you know, you don't want to have ambiguity in that. You want your team to be able to function more efficiently, and if clear expectations are made, then that's what's going to lead to that efficiency. Okay, our list of responsibilities goes on. So the next is education. To become a stroke center, a hospital must meet and maintain certain education requirements for staff, patients, family, community. It's a lot of education, as we all know. A couple of suggestions would be start by educating your hospital staff and providers first. Don't go to EMS, don't go to the community. Start by educating people on the inside first. And then dividing your staff between what do all of my staff need to know, and that's listed there. They need to know how to call a stroke alert and how to identify that their patient could be having a stroke. And then your stroke staff, of course, need to have much more, developing much more of an expertise in that area. Patient and family members were aware of at least the minimum 5 specific topics that they're required to be educated on, and us needing to develop a plan in this area. And I'm kind of going quickly through these next couple of slides because, as many of you know, stroke education is and can be a talk in and of itself. Community and EMS is, of course, an area that we need to look at how we educate community and EMS. I think there's also a couple talks in this 15-week course that's coming up with covering on some of these topics. So our next responsibility, which again could be a talk in and of itself, but is data. So data, you know, it's kind of like the who, what, why, when, how that I have listed up here. So who's going to collect data? And is that a shared responsibility? What does a stroke coordinator collect? What can be collected from the medical record? And I know you all laugh, but we need to have that medical record work better for us. And so, you know, what type of reports can be run from our medical record so we're not then going in and collecting every single field, which some of us have done in the past. So when determining responsibilities, we have to decide if assigning a stroke coordinator is the best to collect the data, and my argument would be no. The program could also consider a partial or full-time position dedicated to data management. Data integrity is important, so having someone that understands what that means. Oftentimes, new stroke coordinators, we have little experience running a meeting, let alone experience collecting data and analyzing data. So a system will need to be in place to ensure that data integrity, ensure data inter-rater reliability. So discussions will have to be had on that. Sometimes when we start a program, we look at, okay, let's start collecting stroke alert log information. It's oftentimes a good place to start. And some of the items are listed there that you could consider collecting. We then oftentimes move into collecting performance measures, and we get with the guidelines. We're also looking at time to treatment. When a lot of us, our goal is to collect some of this data concurrently, and then some of this data needs to be collected retrospectively when we have the final coding of these patients. So it's oftentimes a combined process. And then how, well, I don't know, we laugh about it here, but we have so many spreadsheets that's been our how for a while, but we're moving towards other ways in order to collect this data. So the reports that we run, these other databases that we might have with an upload to get with the guidelines, or other ways in which we can then make the data meaningful, because, right, that's the most important part. If we're just collecting data and not using it, then it's a waste of a lot of people's time. But we need to be able to get to the point where we're sharing data that's meaningful and able to improve our programs. So added to our list of responsibilities is performance improvement involvement. We've got a talk coming up in a couple of weeks where we're going to talk about some PI overview and then give a couple of examples on that. So I'm not going to go into that too much here. Some of us, our responsibility is research as well. So oftentimes we're involved in research projects. Larger stroke programs, comprehensive stroke centers are required to be actively enrolling patients in research. So that is another responsibility oftentimes added to our list. Okay, and finally, I only have a few minutes, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I just want to touch a little bit on like the soft, feely things, which is preventing burnout. Stroke coordinators are often chosen because they're excellent clinicians, and they exhibit this desirable interpersonal and organizational skills. Like I mentioned, they're frequently former bedside nurses, and they are now that central person in the stroke program who are working closely with leaders in the program. So, daily collaboration with hospital administration, medical personnel, hospital-based departments will require that the coordinator need to be taught. Anne Alexandroff published this information here, and she looked at the 5 most common barriers to the success of our role. These 5 barriers include too many job functions, and I just was running through a lot of the responsibilities in these job functions in this last hour. Another frustration is time spent in data collection, lack of interdisciplinary adherence to evidence-based guidelines, lack of secretarial support, and lack of a researcher statistician support. So I'm sure many of you can relate to a couple, if not all, of these that are listed here. I would recommend that you be cautious when defining your responsibilities, and that there's a real risk for us to take on too much. One obvious area of concern is just automatically assuming the stroke coordinator is going to collect data and do everything else. That's kind of an easy one to talk about because it's just nearly impossible to do everything and collect all the data. On average, in a survey that was conducted, stroke coordinators spent 12 hours per week on data collection. 67% of those coordinators expressed the desire to give up that function, with only 32% of the coordinators saying they had enough time to conduct patient rounds. So part of this dissatisfaction could be that we have been active bedside nursing and now we're stuck in an office doing data, to give an example. So, I'm not going to give you this quick 1-minute answer, but I would just ask you to reflect on all of your roles, where you want that balance to be, where the people you report to believe that balance is, because you need to be able to advocate for yourself to say, look, you're asking me to do these 10 things and then take on another full-time job responsibility. Here are some tips for success that are listed here and will be in your handout, and I would recommend you look these over as they might be helpful. And then, this is really getting into the touchy-feely stuff, but there's a lot written out there about preventing burnout and enjoying what we do. And a simple rule I'm sure a lot of us learned years ago, and it's easy for me to refer back to, is that we need to find some sort of balance between the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, our mental selves. And when one is lacking, others will suffer. So a simple example, when we don't get a good enough sleep, when we're not exercising, then oftentimes the struggle we feel in our physical selves are strained in other areas. Or what about those dreaded weeks, days, months leading up to a Joint Commission review? Because we're so strained mentally at work, I don't know about you all, but my relationship with my husband, my kids, it suffers. And so, how do you find that balance? And maybe every other year that's okay. But I will tell you, in the last few reviews that I've had, having done this for 10 years, it has gotten better. So if you're just getting into this and hoping it gets better, it will. So I guess to end on, I hope you all find the balance, the work-life balance, the positive and multidisciplinary team, and really the love for making a difference in our stroke patients' lives in your role as a stroke coordinator. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I want to apologize. We had an overwhelming response for today's call, and we were at capacity at 200 people. But for anyone who was able to log in and you have coworkers or colleagues who weren't able to log in, we've recorded everything, and we'll be sending a link to the recording along with a copy of the slides and information on the next webinar in the series to everyone by Monday. We're also upping our phone lines, so we will not have this problem on the next webinar. But if anyone has questions, we can go ahead and open the lines with *6 if anyone would like to ask questions. As everyone comes off mute, I'll also remind everyone that you will not be able to claim CEs until the end of our webinar series on September 27th. That's when we will open the portal for you to actually claim your credits. Again, any questions, comments?
I think I must have just covered it all and made stroke coordination crystal clear. So.
You did do a great job, as always. I've seen you present before, and you've always done very well for us, so we appreciate you taking the time to do this. One last call for questions, *6, for anyone who'd like to come off mute. I don't see anything in the Q&A section of WebEx. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, it's Allison. I just wanted to say thank you to Alex. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and it definitely had me hearkening back to my days as a stroke coordinator and realizing the just absolute massive amount of work that coordinators do. And I'm sure it definitely provokes some thought for me. So when I work with my coordinators, I will have a little bit more idea of some of the struggles they're having. And I'm sure that our audience would agree that it's definitely brought to mind some things that, they may want to work on, or just issues they didn't even think about. So this is, I think, been a really, really great comprehensive overview of what the stroke coordinator does every single day. So thank you for that.
Yes, and we are getting some comments in the chat box that this information really hit home for new coordinators and great information. So thank you, Alex.
Oh, you're welcome.
Alex, I would like a little bit more information about your gap analysis. I'm actually currently working on one at my facility as well. So if you could send a copy of example, that'd be great.
Sure, and just to mention, I've done it in one of two ways. I've done it based on that, the recommendations for the primary stroke center, that document that I shared a screenshot of, and then I've also done it based on disease-specific certification standards from either the DNV or from Joint Commission. So there's pros and cons to gap analysis from either way, but yeah, I can talk with you more about that.
Great, thank you.
Alex, we also got a question. A few people are pursuing acute stroke ready certification. Would you have any tips that you'd be able to share with them, any documents or anything like that?
I'd be happy to talk with anyone offline too, but I think a lot of the same recommendations in this talk would definitely apply, but would be to a different scale. And oftentimes you don't need necessarily a stroke coordinator, but you still definitely need a stroke champion in that role and someone with designated time to help with all of the expectations and requirements around acute stroke ready. But there's definitely some tips as to how you would create a gap analysis to say, how do we get to being ready for acute stroke ready? And a lot of the same principles in this talk have applied. I don't know if the question too was more related to, will the next upcoming series address acute stroke ready or not? But certainly if you want to email me, we can talk about some recommendations in that area. And also, I would recommend, you know, if you're a part of a hospital system, you're reaching out to your other PSCs and your CSCs. You know, as I work at a CSC, and it's part of our role to make sure that the other hospitals within our system are we're connecting with and working on projects together and supporting each other.
Great, and I also believe the Heart Association has a webinar on our website about the guidelines too, so I'll make sure to include that in our follow-up email too. There's a recording about acute stroke ready guidelines, so we'll send that as a resource when we wrap up and send the slides.
Hey, Alex, I have one quick question if we have time.
Go for it, yeah.
Have you heard of any recommendations, and I mean, I don't know of any personally, but have you heard of any recommendations of maybe the number of stroke coordinators that would be warranted in a hospital of a larger size, or perhaps based on like a certain discharge volume per year? I just don't know if there's any guideline out there like that, but it seems like we have kind of variability among a lot of larger hospitals on how many stroke coordinators they have.
So you bring up a really good point. Dr. Sarah Livesay, she has conducted a survey out of the state of Illinois, and that survey has now gone nationwide in collecting more information because we don't have a lot of data to guide us in those areas, nor do we have data on what's a stroke coordinator salary, what are the expectations of our role. So I know that she has a couple poster abstracts that have been published, and Christy and I have worked along with her on those publications, and I can share those with you. I'm trying to, without pulling up my folder right now, I'm trying to think if any of them address the number of stroke coordinators. I think it was more informational gathering, so it would say at a CSC with this much volume, this is how many stroke coordinators were hired with the stroke program. So I could definitely pass that on to you. But it's an area that we need more research and understanding in. And also, you know, there are some comprehensive stroke programs, and they have 5 stroke coordinators, but those coordinators do it all, whereas you have other stroke programs, and they have 2 or 3 stroke coordinators, but then you have, you know, a team for data, and it's kind of the work is divvied up and responsibilities is divvied up in a different way.
We did get a request to see an example of the stroke scope of service. Would you be able to send that, that's something you can send that we can include as a handout?
Yeah, let me look at what I have and see how I would send that out. I'll work with you, Larissa and Deb, as to what would, if I can just, and my team here, or if it needs to be kind of de-identified or scaled down. One recommendation I have when creating a scope of service, and I started doing this a couple years ago, I didn't always do it, but is to, next to the elements within your scope of service, as you're listing things like what's your, you know, your plan for neurosurgery education, or for or your target population, even when you're defining your target population in your scope of service, you actually put the corresponding, you know, primary stroke or comprehensive stroke standards from Joint Commission or from DNV listed right there next to that scope of service item. It's a great way to say, oh, yep, we've addressed it. You know, so when your reviewer says, tell me what your target population is, and you can say, oh, that's VSPM4, whatever it is, and have it also then referenced in your scope of service. It's actually been more helpful than I thought it would be. I just thought it was me trying to be really organized, but really it's been helpful to the rest of our team, and when a reviewer comes in, to be able to pull it in that way as well. And I think on the slide I shared that you all get copies of, I think I've listed the different topics that I would recommend in a scope of service. But yeah, let me work with you, Larissa and Deb, as to how we can share a draft.
Perfect. That's all the questions I have in our Q&A section. I know we're a little over time, but does anyone want to come off the line with another question from the phone? Star 6 to unmute. All right, then I'll just wrap up by saying we'll be sending out the information for the next webinar and all of the links for the rest in the series. Again, on Monday, we will be looking out for that, along with a copy of the slides and handouts that we've kind of talked about giving the attendees. We'll also have a link to the recording for anyone who was unable to log in and listen to our presentation today, and we will be bumping up our conference call numbers. Thanks for the overwhelming response. We now definitely know that these are a need and that we're filling a need in the stroke education sector with this. So thank you, everyone. Have a great week. And Alex, thank you so much for taking your time to present for us.
Yes, thank you.